mysterious. How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to Cryptid Mysterious. I got a great Bigfoot encounter story for you today. But before I get into that, I always like to ask, if you don't mind, hit that subscribe button for me and comment down below where you're watching from. I always love to see everybody where you're watching from. And if you're curious to know what I use to get my footage, like the drone, the camera, the microphone that I'm using to record these, I'll link all those down below. Let's get into today's Bigfoot encounter. This one comes to us from Ty. He's a resident of Missouri. He begins, "If this had been told to me by someone else, I would have told them they were full of crap, straight to their face. And yet, having endured what I'm about to tell you, my outlook on such matters has changed dramatically. My Uncle Tex had a large tract of land in northern Missouri. The land was no longer used for farming and had well grown in. Over the course of several decades, with all kinds of bramble and brush, as you would imagine. He and his cronies had built a sturdy blind for deer season near the edge of the field which, other than during the season, sat idle. This was a 10 by 10 foot house built on stilts that sat about 15 feet off the ground. It had a welded steel ladder that came up through a hatch in the middle of the floor for entry. Now, my uncle, prior to the season, would put feed out in various locations to see what type of racks were coming through. He also planted some vegetation, which the deer loved to eat. I had stopped by his house to inquire what he had been seeing and to ask him if my buddy and I could make use of the blind in a couple weeks. He said that I could, and he also told me that there were a number of really nice bucks, including one that he said was at least a 12-pointer, which he had seen only once. It was Friday, 2 weeks later, that my buddy Randy and I had entered into the blind at 4 a.m. It was a really dreary day, cold and damp. As we sat in the blind and daylight began to break, we'd seen a number of really nice bucks, but the two of us had been blinded by the thought of the 12-pointer that my uncle had seen. After about 4 hours, we decided to climb down and come back later in the day for another shot at it. We stopped in to visit Uncle Tex and told him what we had seen around. He asked us why we didn't take one, so we told him we were hoping for that 12er. He just smiled and said, "I hope you made the right choice." He was right, in that there were a number of bucks that anyone would have been proud to take down, and yet we had passed. At 3 o'clock, we were back in the blind. It had gotten even colder. The sky was gray, and the wind was howling through the blind, which had open window flaps on 3 sides. The sun was dropping quick from the sky when Randy said he had his eyes on what he believed was the 12-pointer, but it was far away. I confirmed it by putting my scope on him. He was about 400 yards out. It was difficult to determine what he would or wouldn't do, but we were content to wait and see how things panned out. Again, we decided to pass on a couple of really nice bucks. This blind we were in was built about 20 feet away from a tree line. The left and right-hand side windows were faced looking down each side of the tree line, and the front opening faced the field. We had ridden over to the blind on a quad that was parked behind us in the woods, out of sight. I estimated that we had about 20 minutes of light left, and the blind was already dark inside, I put my scope on the buck, and he had closed the gap to about 300 yards, plus or minus. I decided I was going to take a crack at him. I was leaning my rifle on a tripod, getting ready for the shot, when suddenly something jolted the stand and the whole house shook. The two of us looked at each other and Randy said, "Was that an earthquake?" At the very same moment, I saw all the deer that had been near us scatter out of the field. The jolt was so strong that my tripod collapsed and I almost squeezed off a round. We'd barely gathered our composure when the entire structure started to shake violently, to the point we were being tossed around inside. Our guns went flying, and I banged my head against the side wall as Randy fell off his stool and went tumbling backward. I could hear what sounded like the ladder being ripped off, at the same time a loud and gruff-sounding growl. The only thing that I could think of was that a huge bear was attacking the stand. Randy shouted out, "Damn it, my wrist!" Suddenly, the whole structure began to lean over and came crashing to the ground. I went flying headlong into the front wall, smashing my face against some braces and broke my nose. Randy had apparently broken his wrist when the building toppled. He caught an exposed nail right in the right side of his head. Randy was writhing in pain while blood was pouring out of my nose. When the blind had hit the ground, the trap door had sprung open in the floor. As I looked out, I saw a Sasquatch moving away into the woods, and I couldn't believe my eyes. Frantically, I started to look for my gun, which was actually behind my head after the crash, and I grabbed it, pointing the business end of that thing out the hatch, and squeezed one round off that I had in the chamber in the direction of the Sasquatch. As soon as I pulled the trigger, this beast went into overdrive and was gone. As I tried to make my way over to Randy, I stepped on another nail, taking it through my boot, and tore the back of my hand open on another one. I should tell you that there were nails coming through the siding everywhere. I guess nobody ever thought about being in here when it was tipped over and having to deal with them. When Randy and I finally made it out the side window, we looked like we had a fight with some junkyard dogs. Randy asked, "What did you fire at?" Then I told him, "A Sasquatch." His eyes became as big as saucers. He said to me, "You shot a Sasquatch?" I told him, when the building hit the ground, the floor hatch flew open. I was looking directly out of it at the Sasquatch in the trees. I then scrambled to find my gun and pulled the trigger right out of the hatch. I was bleeding from my nose, hand, and foot. Randy was holding his wrist, and the entire side of his head was soaked with blood. I took my rifle and left his in the blind. The two of us got on the quad and headed back to my uncle's house. As we were approaching, he'd obviously heard us coming, as well as the shot fired. When he pulled up, his first words were, "What happened to you fellas?" We were bleeding and wounded, and he knew it. I told him, "We were attacked by a Sasquatch in the blind. The whole structure was knocked to the ground." He hustled us into the house, and we all took a ride over to the hospital. My aunt was beside herself at the sight of us. The next day, my uncle and I took the pickup out to the scene of yesterday's melee. The house was as we had said, and inside had blood everywhere. Randy's gun and the rest of our gear was still inside. I pointed in the direction where I saw the Sasquatch and fired the round. As we looked at the blind, 2 of the legs had been snapped cleanly through. The other 2 were pulled out of the ground with the concrete footing still on them. There were large footprints all around the back of where the building stood, as well as underneath where the ladder had been. The ladder itself was torn free and thrown off to the side. My uncle stood there and said to me, "It's not that I didn't believe you, but I never expected to be standing here seeing such damage. You boys are lucky to be alive. The strength that this thing must have had to wreak such destruction is incredible, to say the least. These 8x8 posts are snapped like twigs. I told him, as I saw through the hatch, it appeared to me at least 10 feet tall and as big as a moose. Then I fired a round. I wasn't using the scope, and it actually thought I hit it, but it kept running. We went out into the trees looking for the area where I may have hit it, and we did find some blood. Who knows where I shot it, but the fact that something could run away after being hit with a 30-06 in and of itself is amazing, to say the least. The blind is still laying on its side where it fell to this very day. Well, holy smokes. I've been sitting in a deer blind, and yeah, you're always listening to, well, in reality, like the only thing you hear is squirrels and birds hopping around messing with you when you're listening for deer. But can you imagine sitting in like a house on stilts 20 feet up in the air, and all of a sudden it just gets busted down to the ground? And then the Sasquatch, I don't even know what I'd do. Probably the same thing. Well, I don't know. He's lucky that thing didn't turn around, come back, and finish him off. But what'd you think of this one? Have you ever seen a Sasquatch? Or know anybody who has? Well, I'd love to hear about it. Drop me an email at cryptidmysterious@gmail.com, and I'll see y'all in the next one.